Well, hello there, senior Ivy Hoda students. This is Coco Chanel. She still has her, you can see her little scarf from St. Patty's Day yesterday. So she'll be joining us for a little bit of Ivy Hoda stuff. So she'll get out of the way here. So here's the plan. As you can see, my chemotherapy medicine is kicked in. So I won't be showing a lot of my video camera, but I'm going to walk through the PowerPoint as if we were in class and kind of talk and review the stuff that we already went over in our notes. And then from there, hopefully this will only be about a half an hour video. I'm going to then walk you through the other sheet that I handed out with some historiography reading of it. I've posted the test questions. I'm going to go over those again with you. You'll have until Friday night at midnight to get all this done. And like I said, we won't be doing anything else until we come back from what was our scheduled spring break. So again, I'm going to upload this. It will be as a YouTube video, so you can watch it when you can. You can put your headphones in and listen to it as you go. The idea, though, is that you should have your laptop out kind of going through this stuff as well. So let me go ahead and get started with what we have. So, we went through that first section of the origins of the Cold War, and now we got to get into some more of these events. Some of the other ones that we've talked about, or that we will talk about, of course, are the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. But there was actually another event immediately right after the war in 1946 that deals with Iran, which, of course, is still in the news. We had talked about where Iran had been a part of the British Empire and a protectorate of the British Empire, set up from the Treaty of Versailles, anyway. But this starts to show some issues between the Soviet Union and the Allies itself, because the British had been trying to set up this oil company. As we've seen in World War II, that there was so much about driving the issue of getting to these oil fields that they needed it. But the Soviets then have tried to obtain their own deal from the Iranians that had failed. And so one of the things that Stalin does is he chooses to simply break some agreements with them and try to go in and occupies northern Iran on his own to get the oil that he needs. So the British, of course, aren't very happy with this. He needs the oil. It was a supply line to the Soviet Union. The Shah had been a pro-German during the war, and so he saw this as kind of a little bit of reparations, that we're going to take part of the German territory, or the German protectorate, if you will, that they had to get this oil that they needed. But of course, Truman is going to oppose this. So when Stalin uses his troops to aid a rebel movement, Truman protests, and he actually takes it to the UN Security Council. And this shows that even Stalin has some limitations in his movements. He does back down. He's not willing to go to war to get oil from Iran at this point in time. And so Truman now has shown that the UN Security Council can be successful, that there are limits to even what Stalin's able to do. There's not a whole lot that they can do with Stalin because of the territory that he's taken in Eastern Europe. But since this was new, now this is before the containment policy is put into place, but it does show an example of Truman already having this idea that we're not going to allow for any more territory to be taken. So about the same time that the Iranian issue is going on, then this is when George Kennan begins to develop this idea of the containment policy. So George had been a diplomat, part of the State Department, and he's a specialist in Soviet history and Russian history and foreign policy. And so during World War II, he's actually in Moscow as all this stuff is going on. And he writes back to the United States, and he essentially lays out his policies in what becomes known as the Long Telegraph. And in this, he lays out the idea that the United States should resist Soviet attempts to form communist governments everywhere else in the world, and that the U.S. would not invade nations who were currently communist. I said that backwards, that the United States should not invade any countries that are already communist. So essentially, they're kind of washing their hands of Eastern Europe. There's nothing that they can do. But it does confirm the idea that the United States now needs to be an internationalist, that they can no longer be an isolationist, that they have to take some sort of active role in what's happening. And so containment, how far as it works, if you read in the Gaddis reading, it goes on, and Kennan lays out this idea that he says, listen, Stalin has to be adversarial with the West. There's no other way he can go about it, that they have this paranoia. They have to maintain their power and strength by making the United States, if you will, the bad guy, and this idea that we are protecting you from the imperialists. But he says Stalin is not looking to use his army to march across the rest of Europe and take territory away. He'll be opportunistic. He'll take what he can get when he can get it, but he's not looking to march the Red Army across over into West Germany and to take all of it. So Kennan says we must have a long term, patient policy that says we are going to stop or contain the spread of communism where it's at its 1946 borders and not allow them to make another step forward. He says we have to be aggressive, you have to be firm, you cannot be kind of wishy washy at all. But he also goes on in the Gaddis reading and says, we have to be sure that we don't back them into a corner, though. You don't want to overstep or overreach this. You have to give them an out. And we'll see how this plays out, even in the Berlin airlift and the Berlin crisis, of giving Stalin a way out of this to kind of save face. So by 1949, Europe becomes divided into these two rival camps. You're either with the Soviet Union or you're with the Americans. This is at that same time that we talked about that the hydrogen bomb is going to be ordered to be developed, and a peace treaty with Japan is now in place as well. And so essentially, containment makes the United States the policeman of the world, the leaders of the free world, if you will, to make the world safe for democracy. And so that's the key with containment. And containment will push and drive American foreign policy all the way to the end of the Cold War. You're going to see how this comes to play in places like Europe, but also in places like Vietnam, in places like Korea, and even in Latin America that we won't get as much into. But this idea of the spreading of communism. This also begins this theory, if you will, that we'll talk about later, the domino theory, that if we allow for one country to fall to communism, then like a roll of dominoes, then the others will come. Containment ends up being very successful in Europe, and we'll see maybe not so successful in Asia. To apply this idea of containment, so when Kennan gives this idea of containment, he doesn't have the ability to enact it. There must be other policies then that are going to take this. And the first way that the Americans do this is through the Truman Doctrine, which is issued in 1947. And it's an interesting doctrine. It appears as a result of the aggression in Iran that Truman was able to deal with the UN. But the other two places that it deals with is Turkey and Greece. And as we've talked about, when people don't have jobs and when people don't have food, radical ideas start to look pretty good. And so in Greece and Turkey, there are these huge communist uprisings as a result of the governments not being able to meet the basic needs of the people. And so at this point, Truman sees this as a threat. Here are these armed minorities, as he's going to call them, that are looking to overthrow the democratically elected governments in Turkey and Greece, which is also very strategically needed for containment as far as the Mediterranean goes. And so Truman in 1947 issues this doctrine, and it says that the policy of the United States must be to support and to assist free people who are resisting conquest by armed minorities or outside pressures. Notice that Truman doesn't use the word communist here. He uses armed minorities and outside pressures. But everybody knows exactly what he's talking about, that this is to support the containment of communism. And it's an overwhelming success in Turkey and in Greece. So again, why does the Soviet Union want to have communism in Turkey and Greece? Well, it's back to that old warm water port in the Dardanelles. Oops, my bad. Let me go back. This has been the policy of the czars going all the way back for almost 100 years of this need for a warm water port. So Stalin sees this as an opportunity to get into the Dardanelles and have this access. Truman sees this as an act of aggression that they need to stop the policies of containment or stop the spread of communism. And so you can see my Turkey and my Greece here. So a little levity for that. So in Greece, the communists fought to overthrow the government that had returned to power. So in essence, what the Truman Doctrine does is it sends about $400 million in aid directly to the Turks and to the Greeks so that they can arm themselves and they can fight against this uprising of armed minorities of communists. The Brits in the past would normally have been the ones to have done these types of things, but they're broke, as we talked about. They're just hoping to survive. So this has got passing of the guard, if you will, where the United States becomes the leader of the free world, and it's a success. The United States is able to prop up the Turkish and the Greek government, and they're able to stop this armed uprising by these armed minorities, and, if you will, maintain and continue this idea of capitalism and democracy to some extent. So the first strike of containment, the first application of containment, the Truman Doctrine, is an overwhelming success for Truman, and he comes out looking pretty good. And Stalin, of all things, is practical. He goes, "Well, we tried that and it didn't work. We're not willing to fight World War III over Greece or Turkey, so we'll move on." And to his good, I guess he does. The next step comes. So some of the critics of the Truman Doctrine, and you see this a little bit in the Gaddis reading as well, is that critics have said that it basically divided the world into this bipolarness, that you either were with the United States or you were against us. There was no in between. So you essentially had to pick a side. There are going to be a few countries that are going to try to play this middle game, Yugoslavia being one of them the most. And it also says that it instills this fear of the Soviet threat was primarily military in nature and not ideological. See, Stalin is always going to go back, and the communists are always going to go back and say, this is an ideological war that naturally that the people are going to choose this in the long run. And for the critics of of Truman himself, he's saying that he's labeling this more as militaristic other than idealistic. Proponents of it had said that Truman's fear was a revised isolationism that led him to exaggerate the threats that are out there, and it made him pitch his message as a global war against godless communism. And we're going to come back and talk about Truman in terms of the historiography a little bit later, where we look at this kind of good versus evil aspect. So, Truman Doctrine one, and containment one, if you will, spread of communism zero so far. The second way that this is going to be applied is through the Marshall Plan. So the Truman Doctrine is military aid, if you will, if you think of it, where the Marshall Plan is going to be more financial aid. So the Marshall Plan comes out of the Secretary of State, who is George Marshall. Well, during the war, George Marshall was essentially the boss of Eisenhower and Patton. He was the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And for those of you who've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, he's the guy who orders for Private Ryan to go be saved. But anyway, he looks around and he tours Europe after the war, and he sees it for what it is. Europe is tattered, it's destroyed. The cream of the crop of generations between World War I and World War II are dead. The infrastructures are destroyed. The factories are destroyed. And when people don't have jobs and people don't have food, radical ideas look pretty good. So he's looking for a plan that's going to help them recover economically. Again, looking back at World War I, and seeing how the Germans were left destroyed to kind of pick up their pieces from themselves, that had there been some relief and had there been a middle class, that radical ideas could have been avoided. So this becomes known as aid package, becomes known as the Marshall Plan. It was intended to create strong democracies and open markets for American goods. Going back to the goals and the visions of the United States, spread capitalism, spread democracy. It's because they don't fight each other. The United States comes out of the war manufacturally sound, the strongest economy in the world. Europe needs a place to be able to buy their products from, so it seems like a good match. The Soviet Union was actually invited to join the Marshall Plan, and so were the Soviet satellite states. In all, there will be 17 Western democracies, or Western European nations, if you will, that are going to join. They're going to receive about $13 billion in grants and loans over the next 4 years. Now, 90% of this will never be paid back. So this is just simply seen as a gift, as an investment from the American perspective anyway. And once the money was there, as you read in Gaddis, there was really nothing that the United States could do to stop how they decided to spend the money. The Soviets' response to the Marshall Plan was, of course, that the Americans were simply trying to buy their way into European affairs. That this is another example of American greed, of American imperialism. You're trying to buy your way into this to exploit the working class and eventually, if you will, continue to march this greedy capitalist ideology across all of the globe and enslave the working class. Stalin knows that he cannot accept it because it would have meant that he would have had to accept it on difficult terms. He would have had to show that his ideology and their economy wasn't going to be strong enough alone to support the Eastern satellite nations behind the Iron Curtain. He discourages the other nations. Not only does he discourage, he outright forbids them from being able to take it if they wanted his support in the future and protection. And so they knew. So in the end, the Western democracies or Western European countries are going to participate in the Marshall Plan. The Eastern countries, such as Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, those countries are going to be forbidden, Romania as well, from being able to participate in the Marshall Plan. Um, in turn, though, what Stalin does is he creates the common forum, which is you have to think of communist information. It had been established to strengthen the links between the various communist parties. And out of this, Stalin begins to create his own economic agreements, these bilateral trade agreements, if you will, with places like Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Romania. And so, in essence, it can be argued that Stalin simply is being imperialistic in his own right. He's going to set up these favorable trade status with this and make these countries kind of fall in line. And we'll get to that Berlin blockade aspect of this in just a second. So here's a couple of political cartoons and things that I found from this. So for you big ballers out there, you can see that here's Stalin. Although Stalin was 5'4", I don't think he's hanging around the rim like this. But this says European recovery at the top. Here's the Marshall Plan, and it's asking, can he block it? This is General Marshall down here that you can see. But these countries show you who received the aid itself. Notice Spain, still Franco is still in charge of this. So that fascist government will not to get, it's the only fascist government still alive. But notice Greece and Turkey. Not only do they get aid from the Truman Doctrine, but they're also going to get aid from the Marshall Plan as well. And of course, that Iron Curtain, these nations are not able to get it. It does show you who gets the most of the money over here. You can see that clearly the British are going to get the most of this, and it goes there from France and Italy, West Germany, and down all the way to Iceland. That just gets a little bit of this. Anyway, so once again, looking at the policy of containment, the Truman Doctrine is an application militarily. The Marshall Plan is an application financially, and it's a success. Not a single one of these nations that receive the aid will fall to communism for the duration of the Cold War. So again, containment, stop the spread of communism. It's working thus far. The other thing that Stalin does in response to the Marshall Plan is create what becomes known as Comecon. And if you can think of Comecon as communist economic policies, although it literally stands for Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, it's just a good idea to understand that communist economies, if you will. This was an international organization that was active from 1949 all the way up to 1991 for the coordination of economic policies amongst nations under the communist domination. So this essentially becomes an economic policy where the Soviet Union is the head of this, and they're the ones going out and setting the trade issues. They're setting loan and the payments, if you will, the interest rates that are going to be created back. And it was created to mollify or to lessen, if you will, the issues of the Marshall Plan because they knew they couldn't get it. So Stalin had to do something. And so he's going to give his own economic packages to this. You'll see that countries that include Albania and Bulgaria, but notice Cuba will eventually be part of this once Castro comes to power. And you also start to notice that some of these, the nations, Mongolia specifically, once communism spreads in Asia, they'll play a role in this. But you notice you do not see North Korea or China. Comecon creates a series of the 5-year plans, the same thing that Stalin had done when he first comes into power. But most trade was strictly bilateral. And again, these were planned economies that had limited mechanisms for transferring trade surpluses. So like if Bulgaria created an awesome product, it could only trade it with the other members of Comecon. It didn't have the ability to trade it, let's say, with the British or the French. And so in a way, the Soviets are also limiting the economic prospects of these countries that it's under. And so that's the argument from the traditionalist historians that this is just being imperialistic on their own, just coming from another perspective, if you will. This shows, if you will, where those members of the Comecon were. And you have some members that were kind of observers and some that were actually literally participating in this. So the Berlin blockade. So here's another application of containment. And so now there's going to be this showdown, and this is a really good map. And if you can see over here, this red dot represents the city of Berlin. The green represents the Soviet zone that was agreed upon at Yalta. And the city was going to be divided, of course, at Potsdam. And this is the city of Berlin itself. I wish I could get out. I don't know how to get that out of there. But this is where when you think of the Berlin Wall that's coming, that's not built until 1961, though. So this divides that sector. And you can see the French gets a sector, the British gets a sector, and the Americans get a sector. And what was happening is eventually the British, the Americans, and the French are going to unify their zones. They're going to unify their economy. And Stalin, in my opinion, rightfully so, says this doesn't make any sense. Berlin falls completely within our sector, completely within our zone. Why isn't Berlin ours? And so he comes up with this plan and idea as a result of the Americans crossing through, because, of course, to be able to get to Berlin, the Americans and the British had to travel through by land or by rail. The Soviet sector of East Germany, and there's some claims of espionage and spying and all these things. So Stalin decides to blockade as a result of this. So Berlin was an excuse for U.S. soldiers to travel through the zone. Western aid caused a huge difference between West and East Berlin in terms of their living standards. He was angered by the decision of the Western Allies to govern their zones and manners of the economically different through the ACC, which we talked about. But he did not wish to go to war through an attack. He was not willing to send his troops into what would be West Berlin and take it over himself. So he hatches this idea: we'll just simply close all entrances to West Berlin by train and by car in an effort to starve out the West Berliners into submission. So he says if they cannot travel and get coal and they cannot get food, because Berlin is a major city, they're not going to be able to provide enough food products for themselves. They need to get this from the farms and the agricultural regions. So he says, I'll just simply block it. We'll starve them into submission. They'll give up. They'll give me West Berlin, and I will win. So thus the blockade begins. But Stalin makes an error. He didn't consider closing the airways. And so the blockade is going to last for 318 days, and it forces Berliners to survive on things like dried potatoes and powdered eggs through the winter of 1948 and 49. But by the time we get to the spring of 1949, this whole Berlin airlift is in full tilt, and it's an incredible logistics accomplishment. We're talking before computers. I mean, this is essentially what Amazon does today, but knowing how much product and where this product is going to go and deliver. And in response, 275,000 Allied flights will end up carrying about 1.5 million tons of supplies. And so, in the end, West Berlin actually starts to live a better standard of living. They have more hours of electricity, they have more caloric intake than they had prior to the blockade itself. So, Stalin really comes out looking bad. His system looks bad, but they give him the opportunity to save face. So, there are a couple of things that we have to give Stalin a little bit of credit for. He could have went up and attempted to shoot down some of these planes, which they called this Operation Vittles, Vittles as food. And it got to the point where they even had this thing called Operation Little Vittles, where American pilots would take and wrap candy bars around handkerchiefs and drop them out as like little parachutes over East Berlin. So as they were coming into land, they were actually throwing candy to the East Berlin children. And it just really showed that differences of living standards between the East and between the West. Stalin, in the end, is able to save face. He cancels the blockade. And containment three, if you will, the spread of communism, nothing. So the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and now the Berlin airlift / blockade are all successes for the United States and for Truman himself. The blockade does worsen the Cold War in a sense. It does bring us to the ability to fight this war, but in the end, it doesn't. By October 1949, Germany becomes permanently, at least until the fall of communism, divided into the Federal Republic of Germany, which is West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic. Now, very interesting. See, words mean things, but sometimes words don't mean the same thing. So we can see that East Germany, we know that it's going to be a communist nation, is the German Democratic Republic. Just because you call yourself Democratic or Republic doesn't make yourself that. So always be careful when you read those types of terms. Okay. So the last couple of things that we have to look at. So now we have a financial response to the spread of communism. We've had a military response, if you will, in the Truman Doctrine to the spread of this. And the last one becomes an alliance, if you will. How do we stop the spread of communism, not just as the United States, but as an alliance? And this becomes the creation of NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's still headquartered in Brussels, Belgium today. It's still in effect. We still use this, although there's been some controversy of is it still relevant today and how much should the United States still be paying for this? Truman didn't want the United States to be the only nation in on this, that there must be some others that are going to help participate. So in April of 1949, the United States, the Brits, the French, the Canadians, hence the North Atlantic, joined 8 other nations to create this collective security alliance. They agreed that an attack on one nation was an attack on all nations. So this goes back to the Triple Entente, the Triple Alliance, back to what this part we would say that Wilsonian idealism kind of comes back around because Wilson wanted this idea of not a balance of power, but collective security. He's going to get this through NATO. In response, the Soviet Union is going to create their own alliance system known as the Warsaw Pact. And it's the same thing. It's just that if you think of the Iron Curtain countries, it's a military attack upon one of them is a military attack upon all of them. The Warsaw Pact, of course, does not still exist today, but NATO does. And it's an overwhelming success again. Now, there's also an interesting, and I didn't put it on the map, but this will extend a little bit further. Even though it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, countries like Greece and Turkey will eventually join NATO, not so close to the North Atlantic, but again, it's that strategic location into the Dardanelles and access to the Red Sea. And so that comes to play a role in this as well. So all's going very well for the Americans up through 1949 in Europe. They've developed the hydrogen bomb, so they've got that, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO. They've been successful with the Berlin airlift. Everything seems to be going fine, but by the end of 1949, it begins to change. So as we talked about the Chinese Civil War that had erupted between the nationalists and the communists, it goes on hiatus as the Japanese occupy China. They unify their forces together. And of course, once Japan is defeated, this civil war erupts again. The United States assumed that Chiang Kai shek and the nationalists who were winning the civil war, if you will, before Japanese occupation, would still come out the winner. And so we kind of ignored it. But again, when people don't have jobs and people don't have food, and now that China has been even more destroyed during the Japanese occupation of this, Mao Zedong's forces offer living for them. It offers them peace, it offers them rice, it offers them land. And so, in the end, the communists under Mao's forces are going to be successful. Chiang is forced to flee the country. He's going to go to what is present day Taiwan, which was Formosa at the time. He's going to establish a Chinese government there that the United States actually recognizes as the legitimate China, at least temporarily, until the 1950s anyway. Chiang Kai-shek's wife, actually, it's interesting. She's going to live to be 104 years old, and she doesn't die until like 2006, I think, somewhere in there. And so, so she was alive up and well into the 21st century. So now, containment doesn't look so successful. But in reality, could the United States have stopped Mao from winning? Could we have supported Chiang Kai-shek enough? And the answer is probably not. That really, that communism in China comes into play not the same way as communism in Europe. And so, yes, there are going to be those, the party that's out of power is going to blame Truman for this. But there really wasn't a whole lot Truman could have done to stop this in the end. So it looks like now there's a major loss of containment when it comes to Asia. We talked about this. So a quarter of the world's population now, 500 million people, fall under the communist flag between the Soviet Union, between the Eastern Bloc countries of Europe, and now the Chinese. So the Republicans, as I said, critically go after Truman and the Secretary of State for losing China to communism. But this is just outright politics. The Republicans and Democrats are both going to do this to each other. There really wasn't a whole lot that they could have done. The Democrats replied that when a regime was fortified the support of its people, no amount of outside help will save it. So Truman didn't lose China. Chiang lost China. So they blame it on Chiang Kai-shek. And again, that's just the way that it goes. So that's where we come to an end as far as our notes on that. I do want to point out a little bit, though, before we move on and end this, to the issues of the historiography. So this was a part of the original. I think you can probably figure this out now, but we have to add one to this. So we can always say the historiography, the winners get to write the historiography, or at least the most open society. And in this case, since the Americans were the most open society, we get to write the original historiography of this. So this comes off of the PowerPoint from part one that you've already done. But So the Orthodox or the traditionalists, those two terms typically mean the same thing. And it's the Soviet Union is clearly responsible, that their insecurity drove them to confront the United States, that there was nothing the United States could have done, that the ideological perspective here is that communism is dangerous. So commie bad, Mr. DeBear, of course. Soviet expansion and paranoia drove them. This comes out of people like George Kennan, who wrote the Long Telegraph, and those early American historians who see this as a battle of good versus evil, the Americans being good, and of course the Soviet Union being evil. But as time goes on, we get a new perspective of this, and new archives begin to open up. And typically, the revisionist flips the traditionalist on its head and it gives the opposite perspective. In this case, this is true. The revisionist said that it's in fact the United States that's responsible, that the United States needs to have markets, it needs resources to fuel this economy. This becomes this great beast, and that it's the Americans driving this for this need of finding resources, living space, and materials. Hence the Truman Doctrine, hence the Marshall Plan. So that the Soviet Union impeded upon these goals and had to be confronted. We had to get them out of the way. So this is an economic issue for the revisionist historians. The ideological perspective here is that capitalism is the danger, that capitalism is the aggressor. This becomes known as the New Left. There are American historians who follow this, but there are also a lot of Soviet historians too. The third view, and this can get a little confusing, so bear with me as we get through this. The third view, I kind of talked about that. You can look at this slide on your own that comes out of this, is the post revisionist. But this has actually now become a third and a fourth view. So let's talk about the original post revisionist. The original post revisionist said, well, there's a little bit of truth in both. The Soviet Union under Stalin was paranoid. They were difficult to deal with. And the United States was driven out of this fear of another Great Depression, out of this fear of a need for resources and to continue to build our economy. Um, and that these domestic policies are what's driving this. The ideological perspective here is that all post revisionists do not agree. Ideology still drives their views regarding the degree of responsibility to each side. And so, what post revisionists have done is to confirm, on the basis of documents and several key arguments, of the Orthodox position and itself. Now, I have John Lewis Gaddis here, but there's actually a fourth, and it's called post Cold War revisionists. So, now that the Cold War is completely over, the post revisionists are writing before, they're writing in the 80s, before communism falls. And so the post Cold War revisionist that now I would add Gaddis into says, yes, post revision is true. It is a little bit of this, it is a little bit of that. But what Gaddis comes out to says is that it is mostly Stalin's fault. He says the only person that never had to run for an election, the only one that never had to truly answer to an electorate or to some sort of checks and balances, it's Joseph Stalin. So Stalin had the most ability, the most effect, if you will, to be able to back this off in some ways. And so that's where these post Cold War revisionists go. It's more Stalin. Yes, it's partly the United States, but it's more Stalin than anybody else. It's not equal, where original post revisionists were kind of, well, this is kind of 50-50 equal stuff, if you will. Okay. Right, there I am. My nice, awesome face here. Okay, one last thing I want to go over. Oh, that's the test. Let me. Where did I go? Come on. Technology's wonderful. I thought I had it ready to go. Apologies. What's it doing? I want this open. There we go. Well, there. Open Sesame. You have these sheets. I gave you on Friday. If you weren't there, then they're posted on this on Schoology as well. Maybe that's why I had it on Schoology. I think this is why I had it on Schoology. Oh, don't look at that. This isn't easy, folks. Doing this whole thing from home is Not as easy, and trying to be respectful of your time. Oh, darn it. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so if you go to the Cold War folder, okay, so you want to go down here to the roots of the Cold War. So J.L. Tompkinson. So you have these notes, and I'm not going to go over all of this because you have it, but you have these notes already. If you weren't in class, then you can see them here. But these are some interpretations of the Cold War from J.L. Tompkinson, which I have as a book in class. And we talked about those two basic questions of the Cold. When does the Cold War begin, and who is to blame? Right. So there's no real date, and the blame is debatable, which is our historiography. So this is a review of everything that we've talked about, going through that breakup of the Grand Alliance and what happened to them, the issues of Poland and Germany, of course, the decisions that they made at Yalta and Potsdam, and again, you can see all that. But what I wanted to go through is Tompkinson's view of Truman. Tompkinson is kind of a post revisionist, but he says that it's more Truman, that Truman as a root cause of the Cold War needs to be looked at. And he goes over a couple of reasons why. One of them is that he lacked any real experience in foreign policy and diplomacy, that he's being manipulated and guided by a lot of FDR's cronies, if you will, that didn't have a lot of respect for him. Same thing with the dropping of the bomb. He received this contradictory advice, if you will, from the people that were around him. But I highlighted here, C, that Truman truly sees the world in terms of good or evil, that the United States is righteous and that all who oppose her are evil. And when you paint yourself into this narrow view of the world, it doesn't allow for a lot of wiggle room out of this. So it's that whole idea that there's no gray area. You're either with us or you're against us. And so as a result of this, Truman also, according to Tompkinson, had this incredible drive to always prove himself. And so he would take these hardline positions and kind of back people and ideologies into corners. And the results of his policies were things like keeping the Soviet Union out of the war with the Japanese, challenging the Soviets over control of Eastern Europe, expanding U.S. power with military bases around the globe. So this is another one of those big ideas of American imperialism, is not only economically are we spreading, but still to this day, we have these military bases around the globe. And so this is seen as a direct threat against the Soviet Union. And the other thing that Tompkinson says, as far as Truman goes, is that he's the one who's going to further develop these nuclear arms to keep the United States in this imbalance of power. Excuse me. We talked about the effects of World War II, Kennan's policies, nuclear war as a cause. I want to go down here for the last part. You'll see there's a little bit more revisionist, post-revisionist down here too. But these other casual factors when it comes to the origins of the Cold War, the balance of power, the ideologies. But I thought this one was really important. G, United States presidential elections. And we see this throughout Republicans and Democrats. And it's this idea that you must look strong against communism to win. That if the other side was able to show that you had some sort of weakness, that it became a political issue, that you could lose, your party could lose power. And so the Republicans are going to blame the Democrats for being soft on communists. The Democrats are going to blame the Republicans for being soft on communists. And in actuality, they're both agreeing and they're both forcing and driving these issues of the Cold War because it gave us this clear enemy. And this would be true all the way up until the fall of communism. And on the opposite side of that, the Soviets are doing the same thing with the United States as well. And so here's a couple of other, a review of this. And again, I put this post-revisionist John Lewis Gaddis kind of into this other issue now, that post-Cold War. So there's a couple of different ways that you could work that out, but there's no wrong way with it. Okay. So that wraps up my part of wanting to discuss the notes that we have. The last thing that I'm going to do in this, and hopefully you made it all the way through because you need to, is to take a look at the Cold War questions that we have that are posted on Schoology that are not due until Friday night at midnight. So this should be of no shock to you. Now, I've uploaded this. You can either type these into this, you could print this off and write it by hand and upload it that way. So however you want to upload it is up to you. But the first question, this comes from the original Gaddis reading that we had, is to what extent were the big three in agreement on their post-war goals and vision. So, to what extent question says, here's what they agreed upon, here's what they didn't agree upon about the goals and the vision. So, it's kind of a compare and contrast. You can see that that's worth 35 points. The second question is an application of historiography. So, was the Marshall Plan an act of pure generosity or one of American imperialism? So, how would the different viewpoints of historiography look at this? How would a traditionalist, how would a revisionist, how would a post-revisionist, how would Gaddis? And Gaddis has some of this information in it as well. These two should take you about use no more than a half an hour each. So a half an hour for that one and a half an hour. So that should give you about an hour. And then come back either in the same day or a different day. It's up to you. And then the identification questions are exactly what we talked about as well. So thoroughly define the following. So they're each worth 5 points apiece. So the who, the when, the what, the where, the why, the significance of NATO, the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Crisis, which is the blockade and the airlift combined, the policy of containment, a little bit of review of the different historiography, the decisions reached at Yalta and at Potsdam. And that will give us a nice background and overview of all of this content. What we will eventually do with this then is write real paper two essays, kind of open note, kind of like that outline that we did for the Spanish Civil War. That'll be the first thing that we do when we come back from spring break. So hopefully that works out into your favor. All right. So I'm not sure how long this video is. If you have any questions, please make sure you contact me. You'll notice as well that there is a discussion prompt for you that after you've watched this, a couple of short little questions to answer based upon this as well. So we're going to get through this all together. This is new, unprecedented. This is you're witnessing history. You are now all primary documentarians of history. So your journals, your tweets, your TikToks. I'm going to be working strong on my TikTok game. And all that good stuff. But you're now documenting all of this stuff as well. So we're going to get through it. Most of the stuff that we are doing after this will be kind of completion types of thing in discussions, and it shouldn't really impact your grade. It is important, as I said, though, before we left, to get into a routine so that you don't let this stuff build up. So enjoy your quarantine. If you have any questions on any of this, get back with me. This is due Friday night at midnight. Hopefully, you get it done before that so we can get this out of the way before we come back from break. So be safe, and we'll check back in at some point in the future. Bye.